Welcome to Power Word Podcast Episode 1. We will start off with some introductions here because this is our first episode of a podcast ever, despite the fact that we've been talking about doing this for, I don't know how long. Yeah, don't laugh. I know it's been a while, but we're finally doing it because we have a fun topic to talk about today. So I will start off with the introductions. My name is Clandon. I am the owner of Warcraft Priest and Disc Priest Icy Veins guide writer. I have been playing Disc for quite a while now. I've been playing WoW since Vanilla, playing Disc since Legion, and I mainly focus on high-end raid content. Next up, we'll have... go ahead, Small.
Yeah, I'm Smallpriest, or short Small for most people. I've been playing Priest and WoW in general for like 5 to 6 years now. I've mained Disc for most of my time and been a member of Warcraft Priest for I think maybe like 4 years or something. Joined sometime in BFA and just been trying to help people out in the regular Disc channel and occasionally maybe sometimes in Holy. And I do a lot of the theory crafting work in the background.
Yeah, I'm Viserio. I've played healer for like, yikes, a decade, maybe more. And I think I played Disc Priest for 6 years, so I kind of like the spec. And I also got this thing for healing planning and healing cooldowns.
That's mad.
My name is Xaph. I am also on the Warcraft Priest team, where I'm a contributor for both Holy and Discipline Priest, just kind of helping people out on a regular basis and sometimes some theory crafting in the background. I've been a Priest main since I started seriously playing the game back in 2006 or so, and been Mythic raiding since the start of Legion in 2016. I currently raid with Edict on the Moonguard server, and I love both Holy and Discipline, so looking forward to talking about the new talents from both specs' perspectives.
Yeah, we're really going to be relying on you to get some of the Holy insight here, because the rest of the guys here are all disc
There
leaning.
is no bias in this
Yep,
chat.
Definitely.
I'm the Holy representation here.
Yeah, definitely no discipline bias here at all. So, but
I've played Holy on Sun King.
True. So did I.
Sorry to hear.
Unconsensual.
Anyways, our topic of conversation today is Oracle Priest. So we had the lovely opportunity to preview the Oracle Priest talent tree, which is going to be the combination of Discipline and Holy, and kind of see what Blizzard had cooking for this talent tree.
Boy, are they cooking.
First impressions, it's interesting. Just to get the cat out of the bag. Now, I want to get, my initial statement out there. I don't think it's terrible the more I've looked at it. I actually think the concept is quite interesting, but it's no surprise that I am pretty confident the initial community impression is going to be fairly negative, without them even reading the rest of the tree, just because it's doubling down on two very polarizing topics in high-end rating and in the Priest community, or in the WoW community in general. It is not only a tree dedicated around modifying power infusion, but it is also trying to go, more along the lines of the more supportish route, which, augmentation of Ochre has been a very polarizing topic as well. Now, we did have the opportunity to interview the devs that had come up with this concept, and they were very adamant about the fact that this isn't pushing Discipline towards being a support or pushing Holy towards being a support. They had the concept of healers in general have some level of natural supportish tendencies because they're a healer, and that this is just kind of an extra support-ish tool on top of what you already have, but it's not going to be changing your role. You're still a healer, you're still a Holy Priest, you're still a Discipline Priest, and this is just kind of a small addition to what you're capable of doing to help other people. Whether other people see it that way or not, or they just go straight to the, blah, 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 support class is bad, we'll see. But,
I think a lot of people will just jump the gun right away and just say, "Oh, I hate this," with it being a support thing. There's definitely, I feel like the overwhelming majority will just say they hate it, and then there'll be a few that say this is great. I absolutely love this. I think there's very few people that are in between it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Although, as you said, the more I've looked at it, the more I've heard about it, I hate it much less now than I did when I first saw it. But it does trigger kind of like Night Fae Guardians emotions inside of me. But I think this is a better version of it. I hate it much less than that.
Yeah, that was actually the comparison I had as well. Like a better Night Fae.
Yeah.
But it is a pretty big like trade-off if you can take something with more personal gain and then you pick this and it's more supportive. Like even if you just look at small talents in the normal talent tree, people tend to pick whatever gives numbers.
Yeah,
and this is pretty major.
If something is 0.5% better, you gotta take it. But
yeah,
I mean, without going too far into covenants, the trade-off there is hopefully was bigger than what this is going to be. Like, I think it's fairly safe to assume that Void Weaver being Shadow and Disc is probably gonna be something that does damage, which is probably gonna be good for Disc. But I also don't think it's going to be like an absolutely insane damage and healing increase for Disc, where you can't ever consider Oracle at all. I don't think that's their goal. So they probably want to keep that one in not similar power level for healing for like the priest itself, but not too far ahead. It shouldn't feel like you shouldn't feel completely gimped because you didn't go Void Weaver.
Right. And I think a big
like
part. Go ahead, Xaph.
My first reaction when looking at this tree is just that it is kind of interesting because there's a few things about it that make it kind of different from anything they've done before. Like there are comparisons you can draw to, the baseline Power Infusion and to things like Og Evoker, Fae Guardians, Blessing of Summer, all that stuff. But there's some mechanical stuff about how this works that we'll get into later, which I think is almost kind of new territory for them. So I think it's definitely an inventive idea. And then like on the numerical side of things, my question, I guess, is like if it's meant to be sort of lower impact, like, and it's supposed to be comparable to whatever Void Weaver ends up being for Discipline or Archon for Holy, I guess, like, will it feel good to be pressing these buttons if they are low impact? That's my main question that I kind of want to get into.
Yeah, I think that's a big part to talk about. I think we'll have a big part to talk about in regards to do buttons feel good to press, especially when we start talking about the left side of the tree, because we had the opportunity during the interview to talk about. Small specifically brought up the question about the whole Power Word Shield and Prayer of Mending style stuff on the left side of the tree, because one of our main questions was, is the left side of the tree intended to, influence Discipline and push Discipline towards casting Prayer of Mending and push Holy towards casting Power Word Shield? And they had a very interesting answer. I don't want to dive into it quite yet. We'll get to that kind of stuff later. But it was a very interesting answer, and how good the buttons feel to press is pretty important. A lot of times, the stuff that doesn't feel good to play around is the stuff that either doesn't have an impact or doesn't have some sort of, immediate feedback loop for pressing the button, right? You don't want to press something that just doesn't seem to have any immediate impact.
Yep.
Yeah, that's part of why I think most Discipline players right now are so happy with the current state of the spec, because of the rework in the last patch of Dragonflight, or second to last, I guess, making it so we have fewer buttons, but each button has more impact when you press it. So I think Discipline players are probably overall pretty happy with the spec right now, and looking at something like Oracle may not give those same reactions.
Definitely not. I mean, it's a completely different thing trying to. If you'd imagine you would trade off, for example, your current tier set just to take away some Dragonflight specific power, you would give that away and then get the Oracle tree instead. It would feel very different. It's not quite what you're currently speccing into or trying to do.
Glenn, can you maybe explain how it actually works? Like, what do we know about clicking the button?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a big question that we had to talk to the devs about. When we initially got the ability to take a look at the tree, we had a lot of speculation of how the hell does this button actually work? You know, is it you press the button, get a completely random spell? Is it you just have one of the random spells available to you when it comes off cooldown, and that's just what you have? Is it, you know, do you get to just pick? You know, there was a lot of different speculation about how it actually worked. And you know, the end result, the answer we got was basically insert League of Legends TFW here. You know, for people that don't play League of Legends, the reference there is when you press the button, it starts cycling through what's basically a deck of cards. You have 3 buffs available in the base spell of Premonition. If you talent into the further talent versatile divinations, you get an additional 2, and then there's also clairvoyance, which is like a rare low chance to proc. You get all of the buffs at the same time sort of situation. We're not 100% sure how the clairvoyance part will work yet. But when you press the button, it starts cycling through each of the available buttons. So it'll cycle through Solace, Insight, Glory, and then if you're talented into the other options, it'll give you Brilliance and Urgency as well. It'll cycle through those 5 buffs until you make the decision to lock into one of those buffs, and you can then cast that buff on an ally. We're not sure if you have to cast it while it's cycling or if you get to lock it in and then cast it on an ally, but basically you get to pick it. You get to pick what buff you're going to get out of that cycling deck of cards. The buff that shows up first in the cycle is random, so you don't know where in the deck it's going to start, but the order of the deck cycling is always going to be the same. So if it's cycling from Solace to Insight to Glory to Brilliance to Urgency, it could start on Brilliance, but it's then always going to go Urgency, Solace, Insight, Glory, Brilliance. Or if you random the start to be Insight, it would then go Insight, Glory, Brilliance, Urgency, Solace, and then back to Insight. Like, the ordering is always going to be the same.
They were also very open to they were very open to changing how some of the numbers work on it. So what they currently had as idea, or how it was planned, was you have 12 seconds to pick what the buff you want to have, and it would rotate to a new one every 1 second. It's also completely off GCD, just like Power Infusion. However, we're not quite sure yet if it's also castable while casting, since, can't cast Power Infusion while you're casting Power Word Radiance, for example. But not being able to cast this while casting would actually be quite problematic, because, you only have a 1 second buffer to actually pick the spell, if they keep it that way. And sometimes you would just be mid-cast and you can't decide which buff you want to get. So that's something they're actively keeping an eye on. And also, the cooldown of the spell starts when you start spinning, not when you lock in, which means you're not pressured into actually picking quickly or casting it quickly, or like casting it on ally quickly. You're just, if you want to have it back a minute later, just start the spin.
Okay, so even if they're very negative about the spell, at least they have some good considerations for it to not feel horrible.
Yep.
That's very relieving.
And something that they've stressed very, very heavily during the interview and surrounding conversations with this early preview is that they are very, very, very interested in feedback on this. They're looking to get the hero talent trees out early, and they have stressed a billion times already that they really, really want feedback. And during our conversation with them about how Premonition was going to work, they did mention, like Small said, they mentioned the 1 second cycle and 12-second duration. That is all up in the air, and they even stated on the interview that it was really going to come down to, once people get to start using it and testing it, how it feels in play. So if we get that in our hands and we try using Premonition, and that kind of cadence for how often it cycles and how often, or how long you have to pick your buff feels too fast, too slow, not enough full cycles through the deck, however, whatever it feels, they're very open to feedback. So, they threw out some initial numbers there, but they did not sound locked in at all.
Yep. They also, just as a backup, did mention that they have other ideas for it as well. Just to give an example, where right now Insight gives the target more magic damage dealt, and Glory gives them physical damage dealt. which we had brought up being something that the priest player would have to know who actually does a large amount of physical damage and who does a lot of magic damage, which isn't quite apparent.
The hunter is
there-
a caster and the
yeah,
death
there-
knight is a melee.
Yeah, there's the option of just changing it to providing main stat, for example, was something they brought up, in which case it would become much easier to understand who to use it on, because it really wouldn't matter. It's just, using on someone during cooldowns is better.
Right.
Yeah, the magical versus physical damage part of it almost reminded me of like Astrologian from Final Fantasy XIV, where they basically pick a card and it's either ranged or melee, and then they choose which person to put it on based on that. I don't feel like that translates into WoW quite as well because of the fact that so many melee specs do a large portion of magic damage. So I think that like changing it to main stat would probably work a lot better in this case.
It was also our impression that this was probably a bit too hard, even for us. I assume you guys would also call yourself veteran WoW players.
I've played WoW for like my entire life, and I don't know which melee I would have to cast it on.
Yeah, like we took Red Paladin as a great example, where so a newer player gets this, he gets glory buff, he thinks, okay, I'm going to use this on the melee DPS. Well, Red Paladin doesn't really do a lot of physical damage. It's not very apparent. Besides, well, paladins do. They're kind of doing magic stuff, but still, it's not very apparent. And buffs or specs keep changing and developing, and going different builds and everything. It's very hard to keep up with all the specs in the game to actually know what to do with this.
And there's multi-schools.
Expectation of knowledge and planning.
Yeah, there's multi-schools where things count as physical and magical, so they get different buffs, and like it's a nightmare. And like not only I wouldn't expect anybody, if I asked a new player, specifically a new disc, I'll use new disc players. If I asked a new disc player, what kind of damage does Shadow Fiend do? None of them are going to be able to answer that, because it doesn't matter for people, right? Like, granted, that doesn't really matter in the case of Premonition, but the point is knowing what type of damage things do doesn't matter for anything else in the game, at least not that I can think of. Like, that's not...
It's just spell school for, like, PvP and being kicked.
Yeah, outside of perfect example. Outside of spell schools for getting kicked, like that's not knowledge players need or have. So that's not something that people have really ever thought about. So it's going to be very difficult for people to, instantly go, oh yeah, that class does mostly magic damage, so I'm going to use insight on them, or that you don't. At least with power infusion. Throwing power infusion on somebody is still just 20% haste. What you don't want to do is just throw glory on somebody that only gets 10% of their damage buffed by it. It's not very intuitive.
Also, I think something we haven't ever brought up, Clannon, but magic damage is also just like that. That's not an actual thing, right? That just encapsulates like 10 different spell schools. And then physical also has different schools for it. It's not just pure physical. There was some boss in Castle Nathrium, and I remember some boss in Castle Nathrium was like, like his damage was like sonic damage or something that was also partially physical.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that easy to know. It's not just you have physical and you have magic damage. You have physical damage, which has different schools that are physical, and you have magic damage, which has different schools that are magical. And there's also mixes of them. It's really not apparent at all.
I would also add that if you take versatile divinations and get access to this buff that grants haste instead, that puts an additional burden on you to know, like, okay, which specs scale well with haste. I want to buff this mage. Does this mage benefit more from 10% spell damage or more from 12% haste, for example? It becomes a huge math equation that puts a lot of extra, expectation on the priest to maybe know the optimal times to use this, and it doesn't feel like that's really realistic to expect of most people, nor would the reward feel all that apparent or rewarding.
Do you guys think it would be better, just kind of a thought experiment, do you guys think it would be better if they doubled down on this being more support-ish? There was still a damage option, but if the damage option was more generic, so instead of picking between haste and magic damage and physical damage and all of that, if it was just a damage increase buff, so it was generic, it was easy to understand, it was easy to use, and then there was extra options in there, instead of having 3 damage-focused options that just becomes a math equation, have extra extra options in there that are more focused on utility, like Solace and Brilliance and stuff like that.
Put an immunity in there, I beg.
Okay, an immunity might be much.
Now
but
we're cooking.
An immunity might be much.
DR, a DR giving like a huge move speed, but like basically like Tiger's Lust or something, but even stronger.
Yeah.
I think that would be way nicer.
Yeah.
Like cook Urgency, Glory, and Insight into one, and then...
I agree. That actually sounds much cooler, yeah. And personally, I think Solace could just get the boot. I think the target healing received is just not something... It's just not something you use often enough.
It's not even good enough to make Disc Priest able to play Disc on the fights where you want the whole of the GS, because GS is 4 times stronger.
That's a good point. Whenever you actually want to have this, why wouldn't you just press GS? And if you need this, then why would you even play Disc? It's just like, maybe it's good for keys where, okay, you can put it on your tank and they're more self-sufficient, but
Might be
I'm
a PvP
not a fan
thing.
of it. Maybe.
I would also compare it back to
your PvP.
I would compare it back to Fey Guardians again too, which, you know, one of the 3 buffs that you could get was a 10 or a 20% damage reduction, which, you know, on paper is really strong, but in reality, a lot of people did not use that buff and they used one of the other 2. So it's like, it's this other option where maybe you could find a niche use for it that would be good, but for the most part, you're just going to be waiting for the card to move on to the next one in the deck.
Yeah, I think you just need to find the balance where, like, yes, you want to have a good amount of options to take from for different scenarios, but you also don't want to bloat the deck, right? You don't want to end in a scenario where, well, you have 7 different buffs you can pick from, and realistically, you know exactly which one you need, and there's 1 or 1.5 seconds between them, and you're just staring at your buffs for 10 seconds trying to think, okay, I need to press it now. I think that would also be annoying, so I think less options you have for the rolling is nice, but also if you include utility, you kind of want to have options.
Yeah, and I think if you go too far in the other direction, right, if you prune all the ones that you feel like aren't going to be used, quote unquote, very often, you know, like you say Solace can get the boot. I don't know if I agree with that. Are you going to use Solace often? No, obviously not. It's a very niche option. Are you going to use it more than maybe 1 fight or 2 fights a tier at most in a couple very niche situations? Probably not. But I don't think that means it shouldn't be in there. If anything, like if you have 1 default damage option in there, most of the time you're going to go pick that one, right? Like the second you put 1 damage option in there, that is going to be the primary use case for the button in most cases, because it's the generically useful, you know, most beneficial in the most situations option. And if you surround that with a bunch of utility, those utility options are going to be inherently picked much less often. I don't think the solution is to just say a bunch of those don't really get used all that often or are really, really niche, so let's just take them out of the pool and have it cycle between like 2 options or 3 options, right? Like
that's fair. I think 3 to 5 is the ideal amount that you want to have. I think below that, like 2 is not an option. That's just completely silly. It has to be at least 3. Probably 4 or 5 is better. You're right.
I do imagine that the reason they have 3 different damage buffs is also because they want to give like some sort of choice. Because if there just is 1 damage option, that's what you're gonna pick most of the time.
Yeah.
So this at least creates some sort of sense of choice.
I mean, it could also just be like increases primary stat or increases a random secondary stat, and then you're just gonna, you know, maybe they'll just math it out anyway, right?
I beg you, do not use the word random again.
They
do not want the word random in this spell.
they will math out, like I say they, but I mean Zelda specifically will math out which buff is the best one, and you're just going to press that. So, in the end, you're just gonna press what's ideal, which is gonna be the best damage option. But then I agree, there should just be a lot of different utility ones for different scenarios, like as you said, move speed or even Solace, sure, or like a freedom or maybe even a small DR, something like that.
Huge immunity, cast while moving.
Cast while moving.
Let me design this, please.
Cast while moving would be interesting. I don't know if they want to put another cast while moving effect into the game with spatial paradox being added, but that would be interesting to be able to grant somebody cast while moving, and then via twins it would give it to us a little bit too.
Well, I think if they give Priest spatial paradox, they can just remove it from Evoker because Priest has it.
True, and then they can just remove Invoker entirely.
Yeah, it's like this Shining Force.
Now we're cooking. This is good.
Yeah, it's like the Shining
going.
Force removal. Yeah, just give it to a different class and then delete it.
Can't wait for the
One other
keys where
thought
you
on just the idea of
one
damage
guy
versus
getting buffed.
utility for it is like we also need to keep in mind that it is replacing power infusion, which is a really strong buff. So in order for us to like want to press the utility side of it, like there's a pretty big opportunity cost there that you know you'll just have to take that into consideration too. Like the damage you're providing somebody will need to be significantly better than power infusion would be in order to feel good, and then you'll also not want to use the other options because then you're not giving anybody damage, which you would be if you weren't an oracle.
Yeah, the move speed feels like, if it was something like move speed, it feels like it would have to be like a raid-wide roar, even, because
it would have to be significant.
Yeah, else it's just too weak. You're right.
And that was an interesting. I wish I had more time to talk because we kind of didn't have a lot of time on the interview. You know, we had a quick 30 minutes in and out and a lot of stuff to talk about and cover. But one of the things I started mentioning, but we didn't really get to go into a lot, was the whole, you know, throughput benefit of Premonition. And, you know, I kind of brought up Brilliance as one of the nodes that's probably a little bit harder to find good value out of, right? You know, restoring mana, it's going to restore, you know, via Twins of the Sun Priestess, you'll get 5%, somebody else will get 5%. So you're getting 10% of a healer team's mana back off of a single cast, which isn't insignificant. That's, you know, it's not that it's necessarily bad, but the argument is hard to make where, you know, their initial response when I brought up Brilliance was, you know, and I get what they're saying, and I understand what they're saying, and it can come in clutch. You know, their comment was, you know, if you get to the end of the fight and healers are and you know you absolutely need mana, and you know the shaman needs to drop a spirit link and he doesn't have the mana for it, and you know, or somebody has a ramp coming up and they don't have the mana to get their ramp off to, you know, keep people alive through the end of the fight. You can clutch Brilliance them to give them the mana they need to sustain the raid at the end of the fight. It's like, that's all great. I do agree with them. That sounds awesome. That would be really clutch to be the person that does that. But also, couldn't you just use one of the DPS options and kill the boss before you get there?
Yeah, I think Brilliance personally would come in whenever there's a fight, which we all know there's plenty of with phases where DPS does not matter anymore. Think Farrak phase 1. You wouldn't be using any of the damage buffs. You just wouldn't. You're just pressing high on full because it's getting back.
DPS players would push for it anyway.
So you're thinking you're just going to sit there and you're just going to be dumping Brilliances into healers during P1 because you're doing a DPS hold anyway, so you're just going to help your healers maintain their mana bar?
For example, like that would be a scenario where I can see where you would use it. Also, I just want to throw that in because I don't think we've mentioned it here. The way Twins actually works is it doesn't just copy the buff that you're giving someone else. They had clarified that they wanted to give you a buff that's actually useful. So if you were to give someone Glory, which is physical damage, you wouldn't just get that as a priest yourself. It's going to give you some beneficial buff. Hasn't quite been decided yet that it's always giving you like the mana or the haste, but it's supposed to always give you something that does at least something.
Yeah, it was initially brought up because of Glory, right? Glory was kind of the note we had written down of, you know, does this work with Twins? If yes, what happens when you cast Glory on somebody? Because if you cast Glory on somebody, doesn't do anything. We literally get no benefit from it. So their response, like Small said, was that they're aware of that. They're going to make it do some sort of intelligent buffing on the priest to give something other than Glory, so you're not just getting a useless buff through Twins. Their initial thought was potentially Insight. However, you know, Xaph, I brought this up to represent the holy people for you guys on this interview. Insight's great for disc, but doesn't actually result in a throughput increase for holy. You know, there's a little bit of an imbalance there. Like, if you cast Insight on a disc priest, great, you're doing 10% more magic damage. This is a buff coming from within disc's kit, so it should increase atonement healing. If it didn't, that would be a little bit weird considering everything else within disc's kit does, so we would expect it to.
Does not work like Gahunya.
Yeah, but for holy, getting 10% more magic damage dealt, you know, by 10%, doesn't result in a throughput increase like it does for disk. So there's a little bit of an imbalance there, and they did acknowledge that. So we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Is that casting glory on somebody won't just give you glory and have nothing to increase your own throughput.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a very familiar situation for anybody who's mained Holy the last several years, is there's been a lot of situations where there will be some source of power that helps Disk a lot more than it helps Holy. For example, you just look at the Shadowlands Covenant powers.
Exactly.
3 out of 4 of them do damage and therefore atonement healing, and Holy gets basically nothing.
The healing portion was extremely poor. Boon, Mind Games, and Unholy Nova all did very, very tiny amounts of healing.
I'm sorry, Unholy what?
Yeah.
That existed?
It had Holy in the word, but didn't really work out.
Holy Priest actually used Unholy Nova in Raid sometimes, quite a bit.
Yeah, to get the int buff from it.
Yeah, I was going to say, wasn't that not actually for the Covenant ability, and it was more for the surrounding support?
Yeah, for the most part. And it also was really expensive, so it was kind of a trap. But anyway.
Yeah.
Not the point.
Yeah. So yeah, just wanted to chime that in with the twins part, to let you know that's not being wasted. And yeah.
We go over the notes.
I was gonna say, do we just want to jump in and go through all of them?
Yeah, we can just go through the talent tree. Is there anything other than, Small and I have been looking at it a little bit longer than you guys have, so are there any other initial impressions or initial questions that you guys had, specifically for Xaph and Viserio, that you don't really understand yet or haven't been answered yet, because you guys haven't gotten to see the interview that Small and I were a part of yet, so are there questions or any other initial impressions that you guys still have that we haven't talked about yet before we dive into the tree node by node?
Actually, I get the mechanics of it.
There is one other thing I wanted to mention, which is that there needs to be some sort of visual display in-game for this, obviously. So I'm not sure if the dev talked about this with you at all, but I've really been wondering, how will we actually know which buffs we're cycling through? Is it going to be like a giant icon on our screen, almost like a weak aura? Or will it be less obvious and we need a weak aura to supplement, or how will that work?
So we did actually have that question being asked towards the end, and they wanted to be quite obvious, not just for you, but for your allies as well, which buff you're currently cycling through and which one you're going to use. Nothing specific as in like you'll see a big icon above your character, like when, I don't know, Warrior switches stance, you see the like little shield above them. Not sure if it's going to be something like that, but it was something that they're aware of, and they want this to be very obvious.
Well, I would have to go back and rewatch.
Wild regards for this.
Yeah, I would have to go back and rewatch the answer. Did they clarify that was for the rotation, like the cycling through the deck part? I was under the assumption that they were specifically talking about, after the buff had been cast on somebody to get the visual feedback for an ally that one of these buffs had been cast on them. Specifically clairvoyance. It was mentioned clairvoyance, that's the big, huge, you get all of the buffs at once sort of deal. Having some sort of visual response there.
Then. Maybe I was misremembering then, but I think, well, for the rotating part, I think I asked that towards the start. It shows on the buff, like on the spell, when you cast it, it's going to change the icon to whichever buff it currently rotates to. So at least that's probably easy to get with a weak aura. But yeah, you're right. It might not show anything on your character until you pick or cast it on someone.
Yeah, that's probably, I would say, my biggest concern about why this it feels like something that belongs in a different game and not in WoW, just because the screen can get really cluttered in this game. Like if you're raiding a heroic raid with 30 people in it, you already may have trouble seeing your own character sometimes. Like where am I looking on my screen to see this buff that's changing every 1 second potentially? If the answer is just on my action bar, like that doesn't feel like a good enough answer. Like that's not going to be easy to see in the heat of the moment. So it feels like it would be very weak aura reliant, which is not something that I feel like Blizzard would intend or want.
No, I agree. Although I do think once you've played a bit more with it, you'll just know what comes after what. You'll see the first icon, either you lock it in right away after casting it, or you just know how long until the ones you want comes up.
Yeah, then you low roll and you have to wait 4 seconds and then you just forget.
If you forget about, then you'll have to wait again. Yeah, that's true. But at least the cooldown has started, so there's that. But yeah, it's definitely something we should keep feedback coming for. Good point, Xaph.
Yeah, having some sort of icon or something floating over your head to kind of signify what you currently have would be probably the best way.
Yeah, I feel like the ideal solution would be something like, I think like Fire Mage and Frost Mage have something for their procs where there's both a vertical indicator on their screen for some things and a horizontal one. Priest, I think, has sort of the same thing with right now, like Discipline and Holy both have Surge of Light as vertical indicators. I don't remember if there's anything horizontal, so maybe it could go in
Discipline. Harsh Discipline shows
Okay.
horizontal. But that could honestly just be removed. It's not. I don't think it's something that really belongs there. It just kind of stuck around since Harsh Discipline was there, which made sense. But now it's not RNG, so I don't think it needs to stay.
Yeah, if Harsh Discipline stays similar design to what it is now, then I don't think that is needed. So it could probably slide in pretty neatly right there. For Holy, I'm drawing a blank. I don't think there is anything that goes there, but no. I don't know. If there is, it must not be that important if I never noticed it.
I don't think so either.
So I don't know. To me, that feels like a natural place where some kind of indicator for this could go.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense.
All right, so I think next we'll just go through the tree and go node by node. So let me pull up the tree again here.
How do you want to do this? You just want to read through them?
Yeah, I'll just read through it and we can talk about each node as we go. So obviously we've got the first node itself, Premonition. I don't think we really need to talk about that again. We've just talked about that for quite a while. We've already talked about how it works. Obviously, big thing to note here, we've mentioned it, but just in case people haven't been following along, Premonition does replace Power Infusion. So this will remove Power Infusion, and you will gain Premonition instead. And it is a 1 minute cooldown instead of a 2 minute cooldown. So it is up more often.
Can you replace spells that you don't have? What happens if you don't spec Power Infusion?
That's a great question.
Is there any other example?
I'm not sure.
There might be. Actually. I'm sure there is.
That can be the first thing we test when PTR or Alpha goes up.
Unspec PI save 2 points. Wait, actually, then you can't even get twins. Never mind, we're not cooking.
Oh boy. Okay. Anyways.
All right. Yep. Go ahead.
So I think we'll kind of go down the left side of the tree real quick and talk about that, because the left side of the tree, those three nodes kind of go together. We could go row by row, but they're kind of grouped in a way where the left side is all, intertwined. So I think let's talk about that first. So I'm going to read all three to start, and then we can kind of talk about them one at a time and then as a group. So to start, we have Preventative Measures, which increases the damage absorbed by Power Word Shield by 10% and the healing done by Prayer of Mending by 10%. After that, we have Assured Safety, which says Power Word Shield applies 1 stack of Prayer of Mending to your target, and Prayer of Mending casts Prayer of Mending casts apply a Power Word Shield to your target at 20% effectiveness. And then we have Grand Reveal, which ties those two together, which says when your Power Word Shield is fully absorbed or your Prayer of Mending heals, gain a stack of Grand Reveal, and at 150 stacks, gain an additional charge of Premonition. So these are all very focused on Power Word Shield and Prayer of Mending. You've got one node that's kind of just a flat numbers buff to those spells. You've got another node that has kind of cross interactivity between those spells. Casting one gives you the other. And then you've got this final talent that involves using both of those spells will eventually result in you getting an additional charge of Premonition, an additional use of that cooldown. So, go ahead.
Before we start speculating too much, I think there's two things I want to mention for this. First of all, for Grand Reveal, if you just look at the numerical value, you might notice it says, or just at the text, Powered Shield fully absorbed and Prayer of Mending heals. For those of you who know, Prayer of Mending has 5 heals and Powered Shield only gets absorbed once. So if you're not actively casting Prayer of Mending, 150 stacks is incredibly hard to reach. They have mentioned that they have the ability to just have this be a different number depending on the spec. So numerically and mechanically, they are not bound to make Discipline Priest cast Prayer of Mending to make Grand Reveal work. There is workarounds to that. However, when we did ask them what the intention with this was, they did say they want, or they are open to giving Disc the option to have Prayer of Mending be part of their rotation as mostly a filler. It doesn't currently make Prayer of Mending apply Atonement through the Power Shield. It could, but not currently. And they don't want Holy Priest to start casting Powered Shield. So this is basically, for Holy Priest, it's just a little sprinkle on top for flavor. But for Discipline Priest, they're open to exploring the option of having them cast Prayer of Mending as kind of a filler spell in between.
Yeah, so I would like to start off, because Small had some comments and I have some thoughts on that as well, but I'd like to start off by hearing Viserio and Xaph's thoughts on, would you like Prayer of Mending to be included in Discipline Priest's rotation? So let's start with Viserio. Just initial thoughts, now that this is the first time you're hearing that. What are your first reaction to the thought that we might use Prayer of Mending?
I think it's very interesting if we had 5 single target atonement applicators, because the game is just too easy.
Yeah, I
just need more. I don't want to cast Prayer of Mending. I feel like we have enough to worry about.
What if it didn't apply Atonement and it was just like, it just did good healing? You just throw that in between when you don't have Atonements.
I wouldn't... I mean, in the current iteration where you want to fish for cooldown reduction, that would feel horrible, because
I did say that.
You feel like you're losing out,
Yep.
no matter what you're doing. But if that wasn't a thing, then I wouldn't be against it, really.
What if it was included in Void Summoner?
Oh god.
What if casting Prayer Mending gave you cooldown reduction?
Okay,
then you didn't have to worry about
scenarios where Disc is like, you have this space between you're done ramping and done DPSing, and you don't want to start a ramp. There's that moment once in a while, but that's where it fits.
Prayer of Mending to power. If they add Prayer of Mending to Void Summoner before adding Shadow or Death, I'm actually gonna start a riot. That is not okay.
It reminds me a little bit of an older iteration of Shadow Covenant, where you just press the button and you get some healing, and you really only cast it outside of your ramp during those kind of low pressure moments. So, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. It just doesn't really fit with what Discipline is trying to do. Otherwise, like, to me, the key difference between Disc and Holy is that Holy gets a lot of flexibility in GCDs from moment to moment. They can kind of, for the most part, cast whatever they need to, in between keeping their big spells on cooldown. But Discipline, like, you need to be casting kind of a set rotation of spells more often than Holy does, so it feels a lot harder, and there's a lot more friction to fitting in some other spell that doesn't really amplify what you're already trying to do. So I don't feel like that's, unless they do something to Prayer of Mending to make it work better with Disc's kit, I don't think that it's a good idea to try to make us cast it.
I think Xaph kind of hit the nail on the head.
I feel like I'm stumbling every time I cast it, like I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, something that I've noticed a lot with Disc players, and I'm definitely the same way, and I don't know if you guys disagree or agree with this, but the way Disc works with the very powerful ramps and the very, single moment focused spec, like we put a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of timing into these big payoffs. Discipline Priest's players in general very much heavily, want their spells to have an immediate impact. They don't like spells that, don't have an immediate or, noticeable, specifically noticeable impact on the, current situation. Generally, even when Disc has been, decent and, still not bad, Disc's popularity has tended to fall off the cliff and fall off the face of the earth when we're tuned in a way or designed in a way where our burst isn't immediately apparent or noticeable, right? Like that immediate feedback loop of I press buttons and I had a massive, impact on health bars kind of makes or breaks people's enjoyment of the spec very often. Do you guys tend to agree with that or disagree with that?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think Legion is like a prime example of that. Like if you ask anyone that has played Disc for a longer time, what was like their most fun experience as Disc, there's a good chance they probably say something in Legion where you just press penance and it just shoots everyone up from low HP.
Or if you're Viserio, it'll be PTR Painsmith.
Yeah, that's also when the booning happening. That's also an option.
Booning.
So yeah, I agree with that.
So, my reasoning for bringing that up is that, a lot of people have been complaining about, oh, they simplified Discipline Priest with the 10.2 changes. Like, oh, they simplified it. We just hit Smite so often. And yeah, we do hit Smite a lot, right? Like, our Smite CPM is quite high on average. We're pressing Smite often. And, the reasoning why we're pressing Smite so often is to push for CDRB Avoid Summoner, to get our pet back up, to be ready for our next cycle. And a lot of the raid encounters, like Smolderon and Farok, and, especially like Farok P1, trying to get triple Shadow Fiend in P1, stuff like that, it's very tight. There's a lot of timing, or there's a lot of timing restrictions and tight timings that you need to hit to be able to play Discipline in this iteration. It's not as easy as some people might think just by looking at, oh, they removed all of these additional buttons. But, Smite may not do a ton of healing on its own, but you do get that feedback of, I press Smite and I watched my cooldown go down. There is that level of response and feedback from the game system saying, your button had an impact. And if they added Prayer of Mending to our rotation, I don't see what it would do. Yes, even if it does good healing, it's not going to be super noticeable. It just can't with the way it works.
Global, basically.
Right. It turns into what's going to feel like a dead global. So whether it's numerically strong or, works really well in the kit or whatever, if they make it really, really good to press, are people going to enjoy pressing it?
And I think
what if it
vast
gives
majority
you
of people
one
would say
stack
no.
of a new charge of premonition?
I think
150.
I think Prayer of Mending is a fun button, but only when it has all the stuff that Holy has, and I don't think you can give that to this. Like, you can make the button good, just give it numbers, but like the way it applies, you have extra jumps from it as Holy. Sometimes it doesn't consume charges. It relieves Renew. It gives you stacks for your Apotheosios. Yeah, Apotheosis stat, whatever. I don't know what the talent is even called. The one where you get 50 stacks.
Yeah, for the talent? Oh, I don't know. That's a Xaph question. Xaph, what's the talent called?
Hold on.
Oh, you put him on the spot.
Oh, no. You're supposed to be our holy representation, man.
Hold on.
You put me on the spot here. I know exactly the talent you mean. I just don't look at the names.
Wowhead.com holy. I got it. Don't worry. Where is it? Bottom right? No.
Answered prayers.
Yeah, there you go. That sounds correct.
And, yeah, like there's a lot of interaction for Holy which make Prayer of Mending very fun to use, which you can't just give them to Disc, right? Like the only one we have access to as of now is Focused Mending, which is also the absolute worst one of them all. So I feel like just buffing Prayer of Mending to do good healing isn't fun.
Yeah, and how much design space do you really want to put, or how much design time do you really want to put into making more interactions with Prayer of Mending in Discipline's kit to then justify having Discipline press Prayer of Mending?
Probably not. I think at that point I would rather see just Assured Safety is just flavor sprinkled on top of or like it's just a more fun way of doing the preventive measures where like Power Shield and Prayer of Mending do more healing. Okay, cool. And now they also proc each other, which just does the same thing. And then just make Grand Reveal actually proc easier for Disc.
Right.
That would be what I enjoy more, I think.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like at the end of the day, the core of the issue at the left side of the tree is just the fact that Prayer of Mending and Power Word Shield are very much not analogous to each other. Like they are buttons that each spec presses, but they don't work the same at all, and they aren't pressed with the same frequency. They don't heal with the same frequency. So I think that definitely more iteration is needed to make that side of the tree make sense for both specs.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, right, like looking at the average CPM of those buttons, just figure out what the actual stat count should be. Because right now, the average CPM of prayer mending, there's just the CPM of prayer mending is higher than the CPM of powered shield, not taking into account the fact that every cast of prayer mending is going to create more healing instances than a single cast of powered shield. It's also interesting that Grand Reveal specifically mentions, powered shield fully absorbed. Not like I'm really expecting you to be casting many powered shields where you're not going to have it fully absorbed, but it is interesting that they do mention it has to fully absorb, whereas prayer mending has to just heal. Although I guess the counter argument would be if you have stacks of prayer mending to time out, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's definitely not balanced between the two in regards to number of heal instances.
I think the way they mentioned they can just have it be different stacks for different specs, just the easiest way to solve it. Like Holy currently between like 2.5 to 3 minutes of time is what they need. So if they just change this to 40 to 50 for disc, you're gonna get that in 3 minutes. It's just.
Yep. No, I agree. But yeah, I definitely agree with I don't think it really makes much sense for prayer mending to be a button that we want to be pressing unless there's going to be significant work into making that button feel impactful within Disc's kit. It would have to be included in some sort of interactions with the rest of our kit somehow, or else it's just going to feel like Viserio said earlier, it's going to feel like a dead GCD.
Yep. Okay.
Do you know how it works with the extra charge of premonition?
We didn't get a chance to ask, so we do not know. That's going to be something that we have to test.
Although just from the way they said it, I don't think they really want to push you on casting it quickly. So I would be surprised if this was any less than like a 20-second duration where you can reuse it.
Yeah, I would assume it's going to be quite a while.
They do not want you to have to rush these buffs out.
Okay. I would like to move us off of the left side because we've been on the left side for quite a while. So let's jump to just another node at the top of the tree, preemptive care. Preemptive care increases the duration of atonement by 1 second and the duration of renew by 3. There's not a ton to talk about here. It's not a super interesting node. There is a semi-concern. I don't know if this is really a concern, but it is quite more powerful for Disc than Holy. 1 second of atonement is quite a lot, and 3 seconds of renew is not that much.
Our current assumption is also that this adds to like just atonement in your spellbook, which then Radiance only does 60% of that, so Radiance should only get 0.6 seconds. But even then, it's potentially the strongest healing point for Disc in this tree. So it is decent enough. 1 second extra atonement is still good on every single atonement.
Yeah.
And yeah, for Holy, I think even when you're playing one of those funny renew builds, you're probably not getting all that much out of this.
The Shalane build.
No, and I mean, there's also the fact that Disc gets both renew and atonement, so I mean, not that renew does a lot of healing for Disc, but it does benefit from both sides of this just on its face, whereas Holy does not.
Right.
So what you're saying, Xaph, is Holy should have atonement. I agree.
Yeah, renews 2% of my healing. That's 0.4% healing right there. You're right.
There you go.
I think it's also worth mentioning, like, even though the four of us are obviously more raid focused, atonement duration is very much not a benefit that you care about in Mythic Plus.
That's true.
So this is a node that would be essentially dead outside of raid.
Yeah, not necessarily dead, but a lot less impactful. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, not too much to talk about with preemptive care. So, I mean, just jumping on to the next node here, I'm going to skip Waste No Time for 1 second and just talk about Miraculous Recovery for a second, and then we'll go back to Waste No Time. So this is a choice node. You do get to pick between Waste No Time and Miraculous Recovery. Miraculous Recovery is interesting. It reduces the cooldown of Power Word Life by 3 seconds and then allows it to be usable on targets below 50%. So it's just increasing the window in which you can use Power Word Life.
Is Power Word Life 15 seconds right now? It is, right?
Yes, so it would go down to 12, and somebody double check that just to make sure I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I will.
I think it's 15 seconds, but yeah, double check that. But it would go down to 12 and be usable under 50%. I think it's interesting as somebody that uses Power Word Life often and doesn't really switch to Benevolence as much as a lot of people just default to Benevolence because it's easier.
It is 15.
15? Yep, okay. I do think it's interesting. It's not insanely good, but I think it's cool. I don't have too many things to talk about on Miraculous Recovery.
Yeah, I like it as well. Honestly, I like Powered Life. I've been using Benevolence a lot as of now because it's I haven't really remembered myself to change it again. But I like Powered Life. I think this is fine. 50% is quite a large room. I'm gonna have to edit my weak R, which I hate, but we'll find a way. I hope hero talents are something you can use for weak Rs as a load option.
True, very true.
I'm sure they will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also like this talent. I'm also a fan of Power Word Life in general, so I think that there will be a very big noticeable difference between being able to cast it on somebody under 50 versus under 35. So I'm a fan.
So, waste no time. Small, you want to have your little waste no time rant?
Yeah, sure. So basically,
Yes.
waste no time. It reads Premonition cause your next powered radiance, heal, or prayer of healing to be instant cast and cost 15% less mana. So just right off the bat, 15% less mana is a ridiculously low amount. It does not matter whatsoever. And then the instant cast portion is very questionable because we have a direct example, right? We have our tier set from season 2 for Discipline Priest, which gave us instant cast Radiance, which actually was great. We loved that. It was really cool. It was very nice, and even though that was also based on just procs, which was very uncontrollable. First of all, you had them very often, and second of all, it also baseline extended your Radiance Atonement duration, which is the important part. Radiance Atonement duration is 9 seconds, which is not a lot of time. If you cast Premonition and then you're going into a ramp, you're going to be casting 2 powered Radiances, which means, well, the first one is going to be instant, the second one won't be. So even if you include some haste, by the time your second Radiance is done, your first one is going to have, well, around 6 seconds left only. So you already lost 1/3 of your duration just by casting Radiances because you're stuck in the GCD. What this means is you'll just probably end up cancel auring it outside of some very specific scenarios, which I think that's just silly. You shouldn't have to choose, especially in a choice node where one of them impacts a talent which you also don't always take, being Powered Life, and then the other one is something that you just cancel aura, and cancel auring it actually also probably means you don't get the mana cost reduction. So this is actually you can't get anything sometimes from this. It's
this is not
really
a good
questionable. I think if it stays instant cast, it should also extend that atonement. Like if it did that, it would at least do something. But it's also basically a random proc in my eyes because you can't really plan around Premonition. We've all seen how PI works out. You use that for DPS. If you get an instant cast Radiance after casting PI, there's no way to control that. You're just gonna get it sometimes when the DPS need it. So very, very questionable to me at least.
Agree with all that for sure. And
Rant
then
over.
I also have some Holy Priest thoughts on this node.
Feel free.
If you
just,
if you compare Power Word Radiance to Prayer of Healing on their faces, like the power level difference in these spells is absolutely insane. I think probably the most common complaint I see in the Holy Chat right now is just the general underwhelmingness of Prayer of Healing. That it just doesn't feel like it does barely anything. It's really only being cast to reduce the cooldown on Holy Word Sanctify.
Yep.
So, this is something that could change in the next expansion. They could buff Prayer of Healing to be a stronger filler. But if they don't do that, then that will basically be a useless proc because you're getting an instant Prayer of Healing that costs slightly less mana. Great. It's just not something you're really excited about. On the other hand, Heal is an interesting candidate for an instant cast because it is a longer cast. Like, it's one of the longest cast times in a healer's kit in general. So I think that there could be use cases for that where you use an instant cast heal and you feel good about it. But overall, this talent feels like it's more geared at disc, and it fails at doing that because of the problems that Smallpriest outlined.
That's actually kind of funny. It feels like it's leveraged towards disc and it's an HPS loss for us.
Yeah.
That just shows you how much love there's for Holy.
Specifically for raid, it's an HPS loss. It's definitely it definitely feels like it's been more designed into other content types, and the issues that surround it for disc ramping specifically in raid is was not really thought through.
Yeah, so I think overall this talent just needs some love. It has potential if they tweak it in certain ways, but as it stands right now, it's not something that'll really contribute that much.
Yep, agreed.
Yep. So just to keep us moving along here, we've got a choice node in the center of the tree here, which is a choice node between Prompt Deliverance and Divine Feathers. We'll start with Prompt Deliverance. Prompt Deliverance just states that it reduces the cooldown of Purify by 2 seconds. Everybody doing Farok would have loved this.
That would have been nice last week.
Yeah, it would have been nice last week. Now, whatever. I don't have a problem with this node. It's clearly a niche utility node, but I don't think that's a problem. I don't think there's an issue with this. I think that's fine. There's definitely situations, and have been many situations, where there's very tight dispel windows, and having a little bit of an extra, buffer window there with Purify having a 2 second shorter cooldown would be nice to have. So I don't think there's an issue with this node per se. I don't think it's going to get used a ton, but I don't think there's a problem with that.
I think it's
surely
fine.
like a PvP thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even if it's just like one fight a tier every, or like 2 fights an expansion, I think that's fine. Like, would you maybe have played this on like the 9 just to make it easier? Yeah, potentially. Does that mean it's a great, impactful node? No, not really, but you take what you got.
Which is fine.
Yep.
Agreed.
All right, your turn for Divine Feathers, London.
Yeah, now we go into my Divine Feathers rant. So one of the most common things we do, well, I guess let me just talk about what Divine Feathers reads first. I'll just read the talent. Divine Feathers states that when an ally walks through your angelic feather, you are granted 100% of its effect. Now, I don't know about the rest of you guys. I know Small's a little weird with this, but for the most part, most priests that I know use an @player macro for feather. Is that correct for you guys, Viserio and Xaph?
I need my movement speed for me.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I have 2 binds for feather. One for me, one for other people.
If I speak, I'm in big trouble.
yeah, apparently Small likes to actually place them at his own feet, which is just weird. I don't know why, but most priests that I know use an @player macro. I have it in the guide. I tell all the new priests that I help to use an @player macro. I would assume you guys are for the most part the same, except for Small being weird. But it's just way easier to not have to have a second click. It's just faster. B, you don't have to worry about any sort of delay between placing the feather and getting the move speed. You don't have to worry about people taking your feather from you in the millisecond that it takes you to step over it, whatever. In situations where you're very grouped up and moving as a raid, whatever. So generally, we just use an @player macro and drop it directly on our feet and pick it up instantly, and it's just an immediate press button, get move speed. I don't mind the concept of Divine Feathers, of sharing your feathers and gaining a benefit yourself. I don't mind that concept. I actually quite like the concept of, being able to give other people move speed and still getting the move speed in return. The problem comes from the fact that Priest in general is one of the least mobile specs in the game. When we need our move speed, we need our move speed now. It is very difficult to give feathers to other people and not get the benefit ourselves. What this talent is kind of promoting is it's kind of promoting playing this minigame of trying to drop feathers at people's feet so that they will walk over the feather when we need the move speed. So if there's some sort of mechanic, now all of a sudden we have this situation where I need the move speed and Divine Feathers wants me to place a feather on the feet of another raider and hope they pick it up right when I need it so I can get my move speed when I need it because I'm the least mobile player in the game. You know, it's awkward. I brought up on the interview, is this a potential opportunity to look into allowing at mouse over macros for Divine Feathers to be able to, or for Angelic Feathers to be able to cast feathers on other people directly? And unfortunately, the answer was kind of no. So in order to use Divine Feathers, you would legitimately have to be trying to cast feathers on the ground at people's feet and hope they don't somehow dodge it, or they pick it up at the right time, or, you know, they don't like stop moving and stop right an inch away from it because they're not paying attention to where you're putting the feathers. I'm just hoping that what doesn't happen is that you don't just end up taking Divine Feathers but never using it because your personal mobility is way more important than helping a more mobile class.
Yeah, I'm struggling to find use cases for this too. I can find cases where it's annoying though.
Yeah. I think it would be a little bit more interesting if it was, you know, when you place it on the ground, you gain the move speed immediately. So that way you can, you know, throw feathers around and still get the benefit yourself. But then, you know, it was brought up, oh, well, if you do that, you know, what you're just going to do is you're just going to be throwing the feathers in front of you and you're going to get your own personal mobility from Divine Feathers and then go walk through your own feather, you know, 4 seconds later and get another burst of move speed. So now it's kind of like you're not really helping other people. You're just giving your own self 2 sets of move speed from 1 feather. So is that really in the spirit of what they're trying to accomplish with the tree? And not really. But so I'm not 100% sure how to solve the issue, but it's like when I need move speed as a priest, the last thing going through my mind is how can I find somebody to try to pixel perfect click a feather on their feet to give them a little bit of move speed when they're probably already faster than me anyway, without screwing over my mobility that I'm already very, very limited on.
Yeah, I would say that the only situation right now where I manually place a feather is in a dungeon. If I happen to notice that somebody is lagging behind the group as we're moving from one pack to another, it's like, okay, I can put a feather behind me, whatever, they can catch up slightly faster. Like, it's very niche and very not that helpful. I could just as easily not do that and it wouldn't make a difference, really. So it's like, okay, this would help that specific situation a little bit and basically get double value out of the feathers, but it's very much not something I would see myself actually using or being excited about.
Yeah. I guess my main issue with it is that having it in the tree, it's something that I would want to use, but it's something that I would be afraid of trying to use out of fear that I screw my own mobility over just trying to help somebody else. And I'm not sure of a way to functionally change Divine Feathers in a manner that results in it working more smoothly for the Discipline Priest without, you know, just, you know, like we said, with the ability of, oh, maybe it gives you move speed when you place it. You're just going to end up using both for yourself. So, like, that's not a good solution. Like, how do you change this in a way that you can still give move speed to other people like it's intended without screwing over your own mobility? And I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the most realistic case for this node is that 99% of players take the reduced cooldown on Purify and then just have it passively. Like, I don't think the other talent is attractive enough to make people want to pick it.
Yeah, I think ideally if you're having a situation like Prompt Deliverance, I think the other talent should be something that's just generically always okay to take, which Divine Feathers is a bit too niche for, I think.
Yeah,
like, Prompt Deliverance is good when it's good, and else it does nothing.
And I have a feeling that the developers are going to be under the assumption that they feel that Divine Feathers is generically good, right? Because it's just, it's increased move speed. And they're not 100% wrong that it is, in a vacuum, generically good, but I think the actual using of that talent is going to be a little bit more tricky from a technical perspective. If Feathers worked with mouse over macros, done. I would use that every time, right? There's no reason. Like, why wouldn't I give somebody else move speed when I want my own move speed? Why not? I mean, I guess there's a concern of, random bouts of move speed on people can be negative. So if you're in a situation where somebody, nobody should have extra move speed, then sure, just cast it on yourself. But, you know, if you could mouse over macro it, I think you would get a lot more use out of it. So I think it's more of a technical issue than a design issue.
Yeah, although I'm not sure I would want to like the add mouse over thing. Would you mean that like you can cast floor aimed spells at players, or just make Divine Feathers a targeted spell?
Yeah, from a technical perspective, not sure.
Angelic Feather, sorry, because
It would probably just mean making it a targeted
would,
spell.
Yeah, I would assume you would have to make it a targeted spell, because I'm assuming you don't want to open up that whole can of worms of being able to cast ground spells like that on people.
I think what they meant, or what they said in the interview, was actually that they don't want to open that macro part. I don't think they said they're not open to changing feathers to be a targeted spell, although I personally wouldn't want that. I feel like that's part of what makes feather cool, that it's just laying around in the world. And, you know, casting it on someone would just remove that entirely, so you can't really have both sides.
Right. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what the solution is with Divine Feathers, but I know in its current iteration, I'm going to struggle a little bit finding good uses for it, but...
Yeah. Okay.
Any other comments on Divine Feathers before we move on?
Nope.
Great.
There's not too much to talk about with Foreseen Circumstances. Foreseen Circumstances just makes Pain Suppression reduce the damage taken by an additional 10%, and Guardian Spirit lasting an additional 2 seconds.
I'll be honest, I'm not sure what made them decide that PS gets the extra effect and GS gets the longer duration, but PS being 50% is very strong.
Yeah, this seems really powerful. Like, Pain Suppression is already one of the most powerful external defensives in the game, so this makes it even better. I'm curious if this means it goes up to 50% though, or would it be up to 44%? Like, is it added or multiplied?
It should be 50. I think with an additional, it should be 50.
Yeah, the way it's worded makes me assume 50, but we'll check. But yeah, the imbalance between Pain Suppression getting stronger, but GS just getting duration is definitely interesting, but not too much to talk about there.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is overall one of the better, like, least offensive nodes in the tree. I think there's not too much to dislike here.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've already talked about Grand Reveal, so we'll go to Perfect Vision and Versatile Divinations next. Perfect Visions and Versatile Divinations is another choice node. Perfect Visions there's not too much to talk about here. It reduces the cooldown of Premonition by 10 seconds, so it's going to make it a 50-second instead of a minute. I think the biggest negative for this node is that oftentimes, especially with 3 of the effects in Premonition being damage focused, you're oftentimes going to want to be using this, syncing it up with DPS cooldowns. So reducing the cooldown to 50 seconds isn't really all that useful, because that more often than not, is just going to be desyncing you off of minute cooldowns, 2-minute cooldowns, 3-minute cooldowns. So yeah. I'm really, there could be niche uses of Perfect Visions, but I'm not 100% sure what the intent behind that node is, because in most cases you're just going to be desyncing yourself. There could be situations where you want to hold those cooldowns, but Perfect Visions doesn't really help you there unless you're holding them for a really long time. So, which at that point, that's really rare. So I'm not really sure what the point of Perfect Vision is.
Yeah, it could pair well with certain DPS specs. It would just depend. Like, I'm no expert on DPS specs, but I think like Beast Mastery Hunter right now is a spec that's kind of always in its cooldowns from what I've heard. So like this could potentially be good on them, but like most specs are balanced around their cooldown windows, I feel like, which are, every 2 or 3 minutes, whatever. So yeah, like you said, this probably would not get much use on most targets.
Yeah, I think when Zelda ran through it, that was also the conclusion. It just wasn't worth it. Even if it was 15-second CDR, making it like 45-second, then 1.5 minutes, and then going back to 3 minutes, that would also not make it better.
Yeah. So the other option on that choice node is Versatile Divinations. So Versatile Divinations gives you the ability to also trigger Brilliance or Urgency. Brilliance being restores 5% of the target's maximum mana, and Urgency being increases the target's haste by 12% for 10 seconds. So this gives you 2 additional options that will show up on Premonition, one restoring mana to an ally, and the other basically giving a mini PI. The primary thing to be aware of here is that if you do talent into versatile divinations, that does mean clairvoyance will give 5 buffs instead of 3, so it is a pretty big power increase to clairvoyance. But outside of that, brilliance is interesting. There could definitely be situations, like Smallpriest was talking about with having DPS holds in fights. If you have divination up and you're not going to lose a use, or if you're going to lose a use by holding premonition, so you want to use premonition, and you're holding DPS anyway, you could just throw some mana on a healer or something like that. But urgency, I'm not sure what your opinions are on urgency, but it feels like urgency versus insight and glory is really just going to come down to being a math equation again.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's a different way of buffing damage, but it's really just going to be another math equation. You're never going to go, oh, there's this very specific situation where I need urgency over insight. It's going to be, okay, we ran 400 sims, urgency is better than insight, or insight is better than urgency, let's always use that one. So at least with insight versus glory, you have different targets based on, the selection there. Urgency feels a little awkward to me in that I don't know when I would press this over insight or glory, unless it's just mathematically stronger, which then my problem becomes, when do I ever press insight or glory?
Why is there none of these buffs that buffs healing? Like 10% damage done. Why is there no 5% healing done?
Yeah, we're not.
That's a good question.
I think that was also what was playing into indifference or the imbalance of power between Disc and Holy here, where Disc gains value from the damage done, obviously through Atonement, but Holy doesn't gain anything. But as we said, there's also a world where this could, instead of being a damage buff, it could just be a main set buff, and then everyone gets the same buff from it.
Yeah.
I also can't help but compare urgency just directly back to power infusion and note that urgency is just a weaker and shorter duration version of PI that you get to press more often. So it's not super inventive or exciting that you would want to press urgency. It would just come down to a math equation, like you said. And on some classes, they might want a 2-minute cooldown power infusion more than they want a shorter cooldown worse steroid. So it just introduces a lot of complexities where it's do I really want to give up power infusion for this alternative buff?
Yep, agreed. There's not too much else to talk about with versatile divinations. Does anybody have anything else to add for that node?
Nope.
Okay.
Well,
so the next node we have is the last choice node on the tree, which is choosing between Divine Providence and Fate Bender. Divine Providence reads that it increases the duration of your premonition effects by 2 seconds. And Fate Bender reads premonition's effect is increased by 30% if the divine spell is different than the previous premonition. So just starting with Divine Providence, it's fairly straightforward. It just increases the effect's duration by 2 seconds. So, you're going to get increased healing for longer or increased magic damage dealt for longer. I really don't know what it's going to do if you Brilliance, because you don't really get 5% of your target's maximum mana for longer. So I don't know how Divine Providence is going to interact with Brilliance. But the rest of them, it's all pretty straightforward. You just get the effect for slightly longer.
Yeah.
Fate Bender is the much more interesting node here. Fate Bender reads that, you, like I just mentioned, that you get an increase if you use a different divine spell than what your previous divine spell is. So if you go from Insight to Glory, your Glory will be 30% stronger because you didn't use Glory the last time. Or if you go Urgency to Insight or Urgency to, Solace or whatever, those effects are just going to be stronger. So that kind of promotes...
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, that kind of promotes utilizing multiple of the damaging effects instead of just continuously using the same one.
Yeah, so that's something we hadn't when we earlier mentioned that it could just be like a generic damage buff to everything instead. I think that probably wouldn't play too well into this. Fate Bender makes a lot of sense with the existence of Insight and Glory, where you're kind of swapping between them actually gives them more power. And as you can tell, they're both 10-second duration, meaning Divine Providence giving 2 seconds is basically a 20% buff, whereas Fate Bender is a 30% buff. So you're rewarded quite a bit more for playing around it than the easier version, which is just Divine Providence. But
although
if we actually only have
calling Divine Providence a 20% buff is assuming a linear
it's
distribution across
exactly.
that 10 seconds, which isn't always going to be the case.
Yeah, exactly. I think with 10-second duration, most classes can benefit from 2-second extra. But yes, it's definitely not exactly 20% buff. It's 20% buff to its duration. But yeah, if this was just one generic damage buff only, then Fate Bender would seem very weird.
I will say, like, calling back to what I said earlier about just how the interface will convey this information to us. Like, I'm assuming we're just expected to remember what the last one we casted was, either through our brains or through a weak aura, and there will not be any sort of indicator on the screen for us to know what the last one was. So I'm just throwing that out there as another reason why I feel like this is a little bit clumsy in World of Warcraft.
Yep, I think you're right. It probably won't show anywhere.
Headache inducing how much thought you can put into this. And it's not even like super rewarding.
Yeah, that's another issue too, is like the benefit you get from playing around it, you know it's there, but it's not really visible. So that's kind of my issue with Premonition as a whole, is you don't really feel the reward from pressing the button. You know it's happening, but it's pretty much invisible.
Actually, the most visible feedback you can get is that 5% mana. Because that mana bar is just gonna jump.
True.
That's gonna be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is gonna be good. Just instant feedback. Pure dopamine.
Or if it's Fate Bendered, it's going to be 30% additional on top of the 5%. Well, sorry, 30% of 5%, not 35% mana. 30% of 5%.
Yeah,
maybe they can make that one additive too, and then you get 35% mana back.
Yeah, that would be a little broken. At that point, you just
go so hard.
35% mana to 2 healers every minute. Yeah, that might be a little broken.
Finally,
that would make me excited about Oracle.
Yeah, screw druids and their innervate. Move over. There's a new king in town.
You know what? Maybe I can have more CPM of Power Shield than they have of Prayer of Mending with this. If I get 35% mana every minute, I might do it. Might bust out the Powered Shield build.
Well, speaking of impact, I think this is a perfect time to talk about Clairvoyance, which is the capstone of the tree. We've mentioned it a couple times, but I don't think we've really read it over. So for people that aren't aware of what it does, Premonition has a low chance of granting you Clairvoyance. And what Clairvoyance does, what Clairvoyance is you grant your target and 2 additional nearby allies all of Premonition's effects. So you get every single buff. So by default, it's going to be giving you Solace, Insight, and Glory. And if you're talented into Versatile Divinations, you'll also be getting Brilliance and Urgency. So if we want to talk about impact, you probably will notice giving 3 people this buff that's giving them 10% physical, 10% magic, 12% haste, 5% of their mana, and increasing the healing they're taking.
I think this point pushes it very much into like, this is a good dungeon talent. Because you're buffing more than half the group.
Right.
You're gonna truly feel like a discount augmentation evoker when you cast this.
Something we're not aware or we don't know yet is how this actually works with the whole cycling through the deck system. Our assumption is when you press Premonition to start rolling, instead of rolling, you just get Clairvoyance. Maybe it could even continue rolling, like you can still confirm it or some shit, but it shouldn't just show up as like a 6th option in your deck and you just have to roll that, hope that it happens, or like it randomly replaces one of the procs that you could usually get. Like you don't start at Solace, go Insight, and then randomly your Glory turned into Clairvoyance. Those options would be really bad because it would just force you to keep rolling and hope you eventually hit it. Hitting it just when you press Premonition would be the best way of having it work nowadays, but we did mention concerns about it reading has a low chance to grant Clairvoyance. And the cooldown of the spell is 1 minute. A low chance, I'm going to assume, is probably maybe 20%, maybe 15% at max. There will definitely be pulls where you're just not proccing this once. And getting it multiple times per fight is like very good RNG, which to me is kind of a bummer, honestly. Especially early on in prog, like think Tindral, think Varrock. You're spending half of your pulls sub 4 minutes or something. You're only getting this every other pull, perhaps. It's very unreliable, very kind of annoying to me, at least.
Yeah, and then the other
Yeah, I think-
concern. Oh, go ahead, Xaph.
I was just gonna say that I feel like in general most healers that I talk to, not just priests but all healers, really value consistency in their kit. Like randomness isn't really something you want as somebody who's supposed to be supporting the party. Like if you want to be buffing somebody at a certain point of the fight, you want to be able to do that every pull. You don't want it to be up to chance.
Right. And then one of the other issues, you know, we talk a lot from a raid perspective, but just think about from a dungeon perspective for a second. You know, let's consider somehow Oracle Priest is the MDI meta, right? Like, let's say somehow we landed in a situation where Oracle Priest is the meta. And you've got all of these groups with these very optimized timings and these very optimized pathings, both running an Oracle Priest. And let's say one group does this huge pull that's like 6 different packs, and they have all these cooldowns lined up, and one priest hits Premonition, another priest hits Premonition in a different group doing the same pull. One hits Clairvoyance, one doesn't. That is a huge swing off of just straight RNG. Like, there's no controlling that. There's no skill involved, nothing. That is just straight RNG. One group got all of those buffs, the other got nothing. That is a big swing.
Yep, it's true. And we didn't really get a satisfying answer for it just being RNG or like being very swingy in the interview. It was just kind of, it is what it is. And another concern we brought up is the potential option of it being able to proc pre-pull, making you kind of like roll before the fight starts until you potentially hit Clairvoyance, or like you're just going to do it before every pull, hoping that you might hit it and then you'll have a better pull, which I personally think this should just not be able to proc outside of raid combat. Like in a raid outside of combat in M+, it should proc anytime, that's fine, but you shouldn't be able to pre-pull roll for Clairvoyance. Is what I'm thinking, at least.
Yeah, I don't love the RNG. Like, as I said earlier, please stop mentioning the word random with this spell. I don't want it. It's complicated enough, and I don't want it to be, like, swingy out of my control.
Well,
But I bet it feels great if you're in, like, PvP 3v3, and then you proc Clairvoyance when you're, like, turning the tide of battle.
Do you get double the procs because it gives 2 nearby allies, but you're one of the 2 nearby allies, but you also have twins?
plus your
Wait, does
twins. Yeah, I'm
Does
not
twins
sure.
actually give you all buffs? Surely, right?
I would assume so, yeah.
It should.
My assumption is Clairvoyance will just... I mean, I guess they could code it in a way where it just applies 5 separate buffs to you, but my assumption is Clairvoyance is going to be its own spell ID that just has the 5 effects built in.
Yeah, that would make sense.
They could do it the other way, but my guess is it's going to be its own spell ID. So you'll probably have a spell ID version of Clairvoyance that includes Brilliance and Urgency, and a spell ID version that doesn't include Brilliance and Urgency.
Yeah.
But they absolutely could do it in a way where it just applies all the individual buffs. We'll see. But that is all of the talent nodes. So, kind of just going... I mean, does anybody have anything else they want to talk about before we do closing thoughts?
Nope.
Okay. So,
Nah.
overall closing thoughts. Again, I'm totally under the assumption that the initial reveal, the community is going to not be happy.
Yep.
Because, you know, again, doubling down on power infusion and more support stuff. I'm not super against the tree. We've talked about a lot of the problems that we have with it. I think it needs some work. I think it needs some iteration, but I'm not against the concept. I'm very, very curious to see where this goes from a iteration perspective and what changes we do see to the tree. Some of the changes that they mentioned on the interview and some of the options that they mentioned on the interview already sounded positive. So I'm curious to see where they go from here. And they did also mention on the interview that there were multiple other versions of Premonition entirely that they had ready in case the community doesn't like this version.
Yep.
So
like the previous version of Premonition that just extended all your atonements.
Yeah, that's what we're going to give to Holy. Have fun having a button that extends your Holy atonements.
No, it extends your renews. If you press it after self, you kill yourself with it. God, bring me back to the Jar Ray testing Viserio, man.
Yeah, I remember the sheets.
That's perfect. That has synergy for Holy, though. You proc your angel form.
True, and then you cast for free. This is insane.
Yeah, that's some synergy right there. Yeah. So overall, I'm not super against this, but I definitely think it does need iteration, and I am totally expecting the community.
It's grown a bit on me more.
To be very negative, even though I don't think being that negative about it is warranted, but it does need some work.
But, yeah, I mean that was the initial reaction. As I said, like after knowing that it works like Twisted Fate W, I've liked it much more now. It's just kind of funny to me in a way, and I don't hate the buffs as much anymore. Although I think with the whole like primary set or something instead and being more utility focused, perhaps would be more fun. But knowing that there's also another tree, being Voidweaver, it definitely steals the spotlight, and having the first one be revealed, or having the first one that's revealed be a bit underwhelming from the power perspective for the play itself, is probably just gonna have everyone bank everything on Voidweaver. Like it'll just be, God, please let Voidweaver be good.
Yeah, it's gonna raise the expectations very high.
Mm-hmm. I think my final verdict on Premonition is gonna depend on Voidweaver, because I'm not against this existing in the game. Like I'm sure there's Mythic Plus players who are like, this is cool, but I really don't want to play this in raids. So if Voidweaver is nice, then I'm okay with Premonition.
Is that good design, though? Obviously we all like our own personal gain, but, do we want to be sitting here looking at one of our trees and saying, great, the other one's good.
Wanting this in Dungeons, right?
Fair, yeah.
I wouldn't be against that.
Yeah. And given that they're much easier to swap than what Covenants were initially at, I think you're right. It could definitely be something that's worth considering for Dungeons more.
It's definitely very heavily going to come down to how much of an impact and how much of a benefit do we actually get out of Voidweaver.
Yeah.
If Voidweaver gives us a massive throughput increase, it's going to be a lot harder to justify playing Oracle. But if it's small all around, playing around with the utility of Oracle could definitely have a much larger appeal.
I think my worst issue with Premonition isn't like losing power. It's more that it's just such complicated gameplay if you want to min-max it. And if I play it, then I will want to min-max it. And I just don't want to deal with that. I already hate Power Infusion for the same reason.
Yeah, and it's not just like for you wanting to min-max it, it's also just for some people that like genuinely, if you're new to the game and you're not experienced, you just can't figure this out.
Yeah, this is way too complicated for a new player.
I also feel like on the Holy side of things, like this makes me really want to see what the Archon tree is going to be like, because that one is, it's the only one out of the three where it has to kind of like benefit to pure specs on their own. Like Holy really only cares about healing for the most part, and Shadow obviously only cares about damage. So I'm curious how they'll kind of merge those two concepts, where Voidweaver is like a very natural combination of Disc and Shadow, but Holy and Shadow are a lot more different, so we'll just have to see. But I mean, my prediction would be that Holy players will be looking forward to Archon in the same way that Disc players will be looking forward to Voidweaver after seeing this.
It is very interesting because, generally, like, thematically, what is the combination of Holy and Shadow? well, it's like disc, right? So,
Yeah.
you thematically you kind of already have a specialization in the game that is the combination of those two talent trees, but now you're going to have this thematic tree over the top of it that's supposed to be its own thing that's combining or at least available to those two specs. So, they can't really lean into the combination of Shadow and Holy because that already exists. So it has to be its own separate thing.
Also, something they mentioned was the reason they were kind of trying to experiment with what they did here for the tree was because Holy and Disc is the only class spec combo that has two healers together. So if they wanted to have something that is like purely support focused almost, it would have had to be this or Aug and Press. And I think those are also similar. I think I don't really have it in my head anymore, but that's why they kind of went with the Holy Disc tree to try out something like this.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, it makes
almost a fair
sense that they
argument.
would try to do this. It's just we'll have to see what iterations it goes through because I don't like. Obviously, it's not gonna be popular right out the gates,
Yeah.
and I think it's good, to Blizzard's credit that they're putting this out so early and asking for feedback actively because we love to see that.
We do. Just gonna have to wait for the powered feedback. Wait, what was it? Powered.
Powered update.
Powered.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're
powered
waiting
update.
for the powered update on the hero talent trees.
But okay. Anybody have anything else that they want to throw in here before we wrap this up?
No, I'm good.
I think that's it.
Well, I think we all agree that we are going to eagerly await the ability to get our hands on this on the alpha and give it a try and see how it does and how it feels to play and figure out some of the answers to to the questions we have still. And we'll get a feedback post up as soon as we can and see where the talent tree goes as we get closer and closer to the expansion launch.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right. I know we ran longer than I was planning on it here, but when I checked the time, we were barely halfway through the trees. So, apologize for episode 1 of this going longer than originally planned. But thank you for anybody that has listened all the way to the end. Please provide us some feedback if you would like to see more episodes of this going forward, or if you have any requests in regards to formatting changes. We'll be trying to figure this out as we go. But thank you very much for listening.